What if I told you that you can turn a one-shot sample into any sound you want? So this simple rim shot can become your kick, bass, lead, and much more. Let me show you how I did this in Ableton Live just using stock plugins. My name is Philip from Pick Yourself. I produce, mix and master music full-time professionally, and I share some of the lessons that I've learned on this channel with you. And there is a free gift that I want to share with you first. It's called the Finisher Framework. This is my 3 simple steps that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. So if you're not yet at that level and you struggle with finishing songs, then I highly recommend you get this. Link is in the description, pickyourself.com/framework. One of the most underrated Ableton Live devices, in my opinion, is the Ableton Sampler. This is such a cool tool. It has so much creative options, but most people don't use it in a creative way. So I'm going to show you how to do this here. And whether you believe it or not, you can turn a one-shot sample into a full-blown synthesizer with this. So I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and we're going to create a couple of different interesting sounds. Step 1, just create a new MIDI track, throw the sampler device on it, and then look for a sample, a one-shot that you want to play with. Personally, I get most satisfaction out of using texture-rich samples. So for example, acoustic drums is great, but sometimes also I use noisy, glitchy textures or an ambient sample or found sound. So all of this is super useful. I'm going to use a rimshot sample here. Just throw it into the sampler, and then we can start playing with it. If you now open up the zone tab here, you can see that all of the notes are mapped to the sample, which lets you play this polyphonically. So I can create a melody simply with the sample, or I can play several notes at once. Yeah, so here it doesn't really create a chord, but theoretically you could play many versions in different pitches of the sample at the same time, which we'll come to later. It's really interesting. So one of the most obvious use cases would be to just go in here into your MIDI clip and then pitch this down an octave. So shift arrow down, one more octave down, and now, interestingly, we come into kick drum territory. Next up, you can define what part of the sample you actually want to play back. So I can zoom in here and, for example, bring the starting point to here. So for kick drums, it's always good to start at the 0 crossing and then have it, the waveform, move up. So the speaker produces a lot of energy, throws it into the room. Then here, we let it ring out not as long. So you get the idea. Everything sounds different depending on where I set these start and end points. So I'm going to put this into usable kick drum range. And once you have selected your preferred section, then you can move into envelopes, filters, all of that good stuff. Now, I've promised you to turn a one-shot sample into a synthesizer, which is quite weird sounding, but it's totally doable, and you can do it with this range setting as well. The only thing you have to do is to go into the sustain mode here and select either this one or this one. I like this back and forth, and what this does is it lets the playhead cycle back and forth on the waveform depending on the range that you set. And if you set the range like this, it's going to be at a lower pitch, so listen to this. But if I put the range narrow together, what this is going to do is it's going to oscillate faster, and faster oscillation means higher pitch. This is exactly what an oscillator is doing. So listen to this. Now, you obviously still hear the starting point whenever the MIDI note starts again. So I can bring this in here, for example. And if you don't want that click sound, you just have to adjust the boundaries accordingly. Once you have selected a range that you like, you can then also use this crossfade setting and check out what this does. This almost sounds like pulse width modulation, which is quite interesting. But now you can change this further by going into the filter and envelope settings. So here you can control the envelope of the VCA, voltage controlled amplifier, so basically the output of this sound. This is the following envelope here. Now it's setting to basically a squared gate. And you can turn this into something super plucky. So from here to this, and maybe increase the release a little bit. So that the note is ringing out more gently. Now, if you want to shape the filter sound, you can activate it by clicking the filter here, dialing whatever filter shape you want. So you can, maybe let's use something more interesting like this one, add a little bit of drive. So this is like a character filter, I think modeled after the MS-20. I really like this one. And map this filter envelope to this setting and increase the amount here. What's super cool is that this also has an internal wave shaper here. You can activate it and decide what you want to do here. This is almost like the Ableton saturator, but built in already. So can you hear that this adds a really nice character and texture to this that it didn't have before? Now, I will leave this off for now because I want to show you a couple of other things in the pitch/oscillator section. Now here it gets crazy because it lets you once again transpose everything, but also spread it in a unison way. Listen to this. So it starts to sound a bit weird and phasey. It's not the best setting for this specific sound. Transposition is obviously the same. Detune it again. So you can basically fine tune it to whatever core pitch you want this to be. And then you can use a pitch envelope, which, for example, lets you glide into a certain pitch. Now we're getting into kick drum territory. You can turn this into a really aggressively pitched hard techno kick drum, for example. Now let's destroy the sample a little bit. We can go here into the oscillator setting and use FM synthesis, so frequency modulation, or AM, which is amplitude modulation. Super easy to do this. You basically just increase the volume here. Like right now, this is a fixed ratio between the carrier and the modulator. I will not go into the details of FM synthesis. This is way too deep. I have to do a separate tutorial on this. But essentially, one oscillator that you have here is affecting the oscillation that we've just created here. But what if we decide to go into a very different direction now and turn this into a ethereal ambient pad? Yes, totally doable. Let's get rid of these settings here. Also this one. We'll bring this back up. Let it ring out a little bit. Maybe use a bit of gliding into the sound, so a little bit of attack time. And then we go back to our sample, and all we need to do is we need to change the oscillation, so the pitch. First of all, I would go into the Midi node actually and bring this back up to its original value. So C3 is the original value. So let's try out a different range here. Then this one we can spread out here. Let's mess with it a little bit more, go into the filter, maybe use a bandpass filter. And now it gets really cool because you can also modulate all of these parameters internally inside the Ableton sampler. So you go into the modulation tab, and what you can do is you can activate this auxiliary envelope and map this to whatever parameter you want. So map it to starting and end points of the sample, loop length. This is really insane what you can do here. You can loop this one. So this is now modulating the start and end point and like loop length that you select here. So this is not reflected visually, but this is exactly what this is doing. Then here, the LFO, the first one, you can basically map to volume or the pan. And the filter. The LFO2, you can map this more freely to other parameters. So for example, filter drive or the shaper, like this is the wave shaper, volume of the oscillator. So we can, for example, map it to the oscillator. Then we go here, activate this once again. It's a little bit of frequency modulation. And now this is adding a little bit of that noise because it's increasing the volume of this FM oscillator feeding into our main signal. So this is absolutely insane. LFO3, same thing. You can map it to whatever you want. You can also use different shapes for the LFOs, even something like a random noise signal that you can map to something like, let's say, the filter frequency. So you get the idea. You can turn this into any sound you want, create super complex sound design and playful variations of your core signal. So I hope that by now you understand why I'm such a big fan of the Ableton sampler device, and you learned something about the crazy possibilities that are hidden inside this tool. If that's the case, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This shows me that this kind of content is helpful and meaningful to you, and I will produce more of it. And now let's get into some of the sounds that I've created so far in this little loop, so you get an idea of how I took things to the next level. So first up, this gritty kick drum here. As you can see, I just selected part of that range. I pitched it down, obviously. And then I used a pitch envelope like this. It started at 24 semitones above the sound that you're hearing right now. And it's basically sliding into that pitch. This combined with a little bit of filtering here. So I filtered out a lot of the top end here. I mapped the envelope to this. And obviously I created a more kind of plucky sound on the main envelope for the output as well as the pitch envelope. Plus I used a little bit of wave shaping. And on top of that, I used a little bit of a compressor, saturator and limiter. But to be honest with you, core sound is still relatively similar. Just a tiny bit louder and more pushed. The bass sound is quite similar to what I've shown you in this example already. So here I've used an external LFO that's mapped to the filter frequency. I could theoretically also do this inside the modulation tab here, but what I love about this external LFO is that it gives me a visual representation of what's actually moving here. So the wobbly sound comes from this. The range that I selected in the sample is actually pretty similar than the kick drum one. Obviously it's pitched down, has this like back and forth oscillation going on. And what's really interesting here is I've spread this out quite a bit and have a little bit of pitch envelope going in. So this is why it starts at a higher note and then slides into resting note basically. Really, really like this one. Next up, we have these echo percussions. Listen to them. Super cool sound design. So as you can see, the sample is completely untouched, but I've pitched around the MIDI notes quite a bit. And what I did over here, this is quite cool. You can see this filter envelope here moving. So I mapped an LFO tool with a random sound source to basically where the note starts. So this is why this is moving around so much, and this creates just an additional nice texture and variation between every single hit. So this is a little bit random, but I love this stuff. So bandpass filter filtering out a lot of this, and a little bit of wave shaping also going on. On top of this, you have a little bit of a echo device. It's not doing anything crazy that I need to show here. But what I love to do in these kinds of settings is use a ping pong with a little bit of reverb. So ping pong delay just means it's coming from left and right. And I think this creates a very nice, interesting texture and atmosphere. The next sound we have here is a pad. Now this is interesting. As you can see, I used just a very tiny fraction of that overall rimshot sample. Once again, the back and forth oscillation mode. And the rest is just a little bit of filtering going on, not anything crazy. So even here, like I spread it out a little bit, but that's it. It's just about the right selection of what specific part you want to use here and a little bit of reverb on top of that. That's basically it. And no one can believe that this comes from a rimshot sample originally. Now listen to the snare sound here. So I intentionally destroyed this so that it sounds very gritty. It's not sounding like a real snare, of course. This is mainly done with the selection of a shorter bit of the initial rimshot. And then I used a lot of pitch envelope and also FM synthesis to get this gritty sound going. So this is like a square modulator modulating our sound source. Tiny bit of hybrid reverb on top of that. And filter, obviously, relatively sharp and more plucky sound. Now let's go to the hi-hat. If you want to create hi-hat sounds out of anything, just select a very small range. And then this is really important, use FM modulation and bring it up and play around with this coarse tuning here. So I just use a sine wave. You can also use a triangle wave or try out some of the different ones. But this is creating a really sharp and clear hi-hat sound that I really like. And yeah, that's it. Basically just a little bit of reverb on top. And obviously I filtered out a little bit of the low end here. And last but not least, our lead sound. So there's a lot of cool modulation going on. What I did here is I selected, first of all, a relatively smooth sounding part of the sample. So this is almost sine wavy. And I used a little bit of amplitude modulation. And here you can see a couple of things moving thanks to this LFO here. So this is modulating the filter frequency. But also a couple of other parameters. So here for this main envelope, you can see that it's increasing and decreasing the sustain and also the release. This is why the notes are sometimes longer, sometimes a little bit sharper. This creates like the different individual hits, which I think is a very, very cool trick. Now all of that feeds into an echo and into a filter delay. It's incredible that all of these sounds were created from the same source, same one-shot sample. And now I want you to experiment with this, go out into the wild world and be playful. So I would like to hear from you. What is your main takeaway from this tutorial? What are some follow-up questions that you might have? And what is stuff that you would like to add to this? Leave a comment below and let everyone know. That is it for this one. See you in the next video.